The city was alive with chaos, the kind of noise and movement that seemed to fill every corner of the air. Horns blared impatiently as the rain-slicked streets gleamed under the glow of streetlights. It was supposed to be a quick ride home, just another routine commute at the end of a long day, but the traffic had other plans. And so did he. The driver, Mark, wasn't like the usual cabbies I'd encountered. He was younger, maybe in his early 30s, with a rugged edge to his face that matched the gruffness of his voice when he asked where I was headed. He had a jawline that looked like it had been carved out of stone, dark stubble framing his chin, and eyes that flickered with something I couldn't quite place. I tried not to stare, but there was something magnetic about him, something that made me glance up from my phone more than once as we crawled through the congested streets. "You're not in a rush, are you?" he asked, his voice deep and steady, cutting through the low hum of the radio. He glanced at me through the rearview mirror, one brow raised, his lips curving into the hint of a smirk. I shook my head. "Not really. Looks like no one's going anywhere fast tonight." He chuckled, a low sound that resonated in the small space between us. "Yeah, it's one of those nights." The cab smelled faintly of leather and something woodsy, a cologne that lingered subtly in the air. I shifted in my seat, the coolness of the window against my arm doing little to ease the sudden warmth spreading through me. Mark's presence was palpable, filling the space in a way that made it hard to ignore him, even when I tried to focus on the passing blur of taillights outside. For a while, we didn't speak. The silence wasn't awkward, but it was heavy, charged with an energy I couldn't quite define. The rain tapped against the windshield in a rhythmic pattern, the occasional hiss of tires on wet pavement punctuating the quiet. Mark's hand rested on the gear shift, his fingers tapping idly in time with the music, and I found my gaze drawn to them. Strong hands, calloused, like he worked with them often. I quickly looked away, my cheeks warming when I realized I'd been staring too long. "You okay back there?" he asked, his voice pulling me from my thoughts. "Yeah," I said quickly, sitting up straighter. "Just tired." He nodded, his eyes flicking back to the road. "Long day?" "You could say that." Mark didn't press for details, but the weight of his gaze lingered on me for a beat too long before returning to the windshield. The city crawled by outside, neon signs reflecting off the rain-soaked streets, but I barely noticed. The cab felt too small all of a sudden, the air thick with something unspoken. The traffic came to a complete standstill, cars stretching endlessly ahead of us. Mark sighed, running a hand through his dark hair before leaning back in his seat. "This might take a while." I nodded, unsure of what to say. The tension between us was growing, an undercurrent I couldn't ignore but didn't know how to address. His movements were deliberate, slow, as he reached for the radio dial, flipping through stations until he landed on something soft and instrumental. The music filled the space, adding to the intimacy of the moment. "You don't mind, do you?" he asked, gesturing toward the radio. "No, it's fine," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Mark's eyes met mine in the mirror again, and this time he didn't look away immediately. There was something in his gaze, a curiosity, maybe even an invitation, that made my pulse quicken. I tried to focus on the window, on anything but the way his gaze seemed to linger, but it was impossible to ignore. "Guess we're stuck here for a bit," he said, his tone casual but his eyes saying something else entirely. I nodded, swallowing the lump forming in my throat. The cab felt warmer now, though I couldn't tell if it was from the rain fogging up the windows or the way Mark's presence filled every inch of the space between us. He adjusted in his seat, the leather creaking softly under his weight, and the sound made my stomach flutter for reasons I didn't want to analyze. "So," he said after a moment, his voice low and calm, "you always this quiet, or is it just me?" I blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What?" "You haven't said much since you got in," he said, his gaze darting back to me in the mirror. "Makes me wonder if you're the shy type, or if I'm just boring you." I let out a nervous laugh, shaking my head. "No, it's not that. Don't usually talk much with cab drivers." "Fair enough," he said, his lips curving into a small smile. "But if you change your mind, I'm all ears." There was something disarming about the way he said it, the easy confidence in his voice. It made me want to let my guard down, to say something more, but I didn't know where to start. Instead, I let the silence stretch on, broken only by the soft hum of the music and the rain tapping against the windshield. The traffic hadn't moved in what felt like forever, and Mark shifted again, this time turning slightly in his seat to face me. The gesture was casual, but his eyes were anything but. They were sharp, focused, like he was trying to read something in me that I wasn't ready to reveal. "You sure you're okay?" he asked, his tone softer now, almost concerned. I nodded, but the intensity of his gaze made it hard to hold his stare. "Yeah," I said, looking down at my hands. "Just a lot on my mind." "Want to talk about it?" The question hung in the air between us, heavier than it should have been. There was no reason to tell him anything. He was a stranger after all, but something about the way he looked at me made it hard to hold back. His gaze wasn't just curious, it was understanding, like he could already see the weight I was carrying and was offering to share it. "I don't even know where to start," I admitted, my voice barely audible. Mark nodded, leaning back in his seat but keeping his eyes on me. "Sometimes, just saying it out loud helps," he said. "No pressure, though." I hesitated, unsure if I wanted to open that door, but the words were already on the tip of my tongue, and before I could stop myself, they came spilling out. "It's just, everything feels so uncertain right now," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "Work, life. I feel like I'm stuck in this loop, like I'm going through the motions without really going anywhere." Mark didn't interrupt, didn't try to fill the silence that followed. He just watched me, his expression calm but attentive, and the weight of his gaze felt like a lifeline I hadn't realized I needed. "I guess that sounds stupid," I added quickly, shaking my head. "You probably hear this kind of thing all the time." "Not stupid," he said firmly. "Honest, and you'd be surprised how rare that is." His words caught me off guard, and for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. There was a sincerity in his voice that made my chest ache, a quiet reassurance that felt far too intimate for a conversation between strangers. "Thanks," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Any time." The air between us shifted again, the tension thickening in a way that felt both unsettling and magnetic. He didn't look away this time, his eyes holding mine like he was daring me to say something, to close the distance that had been narrowing ever since I stepped into his cab. "You've got that look," he said suddenly, his voice low and even. "What look?" I asked, my heart racing. "The one people get when they're not sure if they want to say what they're thinking." I let out a nervous laugh, my cheeks burning under his gaze. "Maybe I'm just trying to figure you out." Mark raised an eyebrow, his smirk widening. "Fair enough," he said. "Let me know when you do." His words were playful, but there was an undercurrent to them that made my pulse quicken. I looked away, staring out the window at the rain streaking down the glass, but I could still feel his eyes on me, heavy and unrelenting. The traffic hadn't moved an inch, and the cab felt impossibly small now, the air thick with unspoken tension. I could hear every sound, the rain, the soft hum of the music, the steady rhythm of my own breathing, and each one seemed louder, sharper, as if the world outside had faded away entirely. "Can I ask you something?" Mark said, his voice breaking the silence. I glanced back at him, my throat dry. "Sure." "What are you really thinking right now?" he asked, his eyes locked on mine. The question was so direct, so disarming that I didn't know how to answer. My mind raced, searching for a safe response, but nothing came. And in that moment, with his gaze pinning me in place, I realized I didn't want to lie. "I'm thinking about how this feels different," I said, my voice barely audible. Mark's expression didn't change, but his eyes darkened slightly, his gaze dropping to my lips for the briefest of moments before returning to my eyes. different how. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "I don't know," I admitted. I don't usually feel this way around someone I just met." The corner of his mouth twitched, and for a moment I thought he might say something else. But instead, he turned back to the windshield, his jaw tightening as he stared out at the unmoving sea of cars ahead of us. "Yeah," he said softly, almost to himself. "It feels different for me, too." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt a warmth rising in my chest that I couldn't explain. The silence between us was charged now, every second stretching out like an eternity. I wanted to say something to break the tension, but the weight of his words left me speechless. And then he did something I didn't expect. He turned off the radio, the cab falling into complete silence except for the sound of the rain. He glanced back at me, his eyes searching mine, and for a moment it felt like the world outside didn't exist. "I think we're going to be here for a while," he said, his voice low and steady. "Might as well make the most of it." The cab felt like it had shrunk, the space between us charged with an intensity that I couldn't ignore. Mark's words lingered in the air, heavy and suggestive, and I wasn't sure if I should respond or let the moment pass. My pulse was hammering in my ears, every instinct in me screaming to look away, to find some excuse to break the tension. But I didn't. I couldn't. Mark shifted in his seat, his hand resting on the back of the passenger seat as he turned slightly to face me. His eyes were locked on mine, sharp and unrelenting, and I felt like he was waiting for something. For me to say something, to make a move, to acknowledge the unspoken thing that had been growing between us since the moment I'd climbed into his cab. "You don't talk much, do you?" he said finally, his voice low but laced with something I couldn't quite place. I forced a laugh, the sound shaky and weak. "Guess I'm not used to having conversations like this in a taxi." His lips twitched into a smirk, his gaze dropping to my hands where they rested awkwardly in my lap. "Yeah," he said, his tone softening. "This isn't exactly normal, is it?" "No," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark leaned back slightly, his hand sliding down to rest on the center console. His fingers tapped lightly against the edge, the movement small but deliberate, and I couldn't stop my eyes from following the motion. There was something so confident about him, so self-assured, and it made my stomach twist with a mix of nerves and something deeper, something I didn't want to name. "Tell me to stop," he said suddenly, his voice quiet but firm. My head snapped up, my eyes meeting his in the dim light of the cab. "What?" "Tell me to stop," he repeated, his gaze steady and unflinching. "If this is too much, if I'm reading this wrong, just say the word." The air felt heavy between us, the weight of his words pressing down on me. My mind was racing, every logical thought screaming at me to say something to pull back before this went any further, but I couldn't. I didn't want to. "I don't want you to stop," I said, the words slipping out before I could think better of them. Mark's eyes darkened, the intensity in his gaze sending a shiver down my spine. He didn't move right away, as if giving me one last chance to change my mind, but when I didn't, he leaned forward, his hand brushing against my knee. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me that I couldn't ignore. "Say something," he murmured, his voice so close now that I could feel the heat of his breath. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my voice trembling. Mark's fingers tightened slightly on my knee, his touch grounding me in a way that felt both overwhelming and comforting. "Then don't say anything," he said, his lips curving into a small, almost teasing smile. "Just tell me if I'm wrong." He wasn't wrong. I didn't know how or when it had happened, but the pull between us had become undeniable. I felt like I was standing on the edge of something vast and dangerous, but instead of fear, all I felt was the overwhelming urge to take the leap. "You're not wrong," I said softly. Mark's smile widened, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly as he let out a quiet breath. "Good," he said, his hand sliding up just a fraction higher, the warmth of his palm seeping through the fabric of my pants. "Because I've been trying to figure you out since the moment you got in this cab." I swallowed hard, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure he could hear it. "What do you mean?" He tilted his head slightly, his eyes never leaving mine. "I mean, there's something about you," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "The way you look at me, like you're trying not to but can't help yourself, makes me wonder what you're thinking." I felt my cheeks burn, the truth of his words hitting far too close to home. I had been looking at him, drawn to him in a way that I couldn't explain, and now that he'd called me out on it, there was no point in denying it. "I guess I'm just curious," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Mark's smirk deepened, his hand tightening on my leg just enough to make my breath hitch. "Curious, huh?" he said, his tone playful but laced with something darker, something more intense. "About what?" "About you," I admitted, the words slipping out before I could stop them. "About this." The silence that followed was thick, every second stretching out like an eternity. Mark's eyes searched mine, his expression unreadable, and for a moment I thought I might have gone too far. But then he leaned closer, his hand sliding further up my leg as his other hand rested on the back of the seat, caging me in. "Let me make it easy for you," he said, his voice a low rumble. "If you don't want this, just say the word, and I'll stop. No questions, no hard feelings." I couldn't speak, couldn't move, couldn't think of anything except the heat of his hand on my leg and the way his eyes seemed to see right through me. And then, without thinking, I reached up, my fingers brushing against the edge of his jacket, and the tension between us snapped like a rubber band stretched too far. Mark's lips were on mine before I could process what was happening, the kiss rough and urgent, as if he'd been holding back for far too long. His hand slid up to my waist, pulling me closer as his other hand tangled in my hair, and I felt myself melting into him, the world outside the cab fading into nothing. The rain continued to fall, the soft patter against the windows the only sound as we moved together in the small, enclosed space. Every touch, every kiss, every breath felt electric, charged with a heat that made it impossible to think about anything but him. I didn't care about the traffic, didn't care about the time or the city or anything else. All I cared about was this moment, this connection that felt as inevitable as it was impossible to ignore. When we finally pulled apart, both of us breathing heavily, Mark rested his forehead against mine, his hand still holding me in place. "You okay?" he asked, his voice softer now, but no less intense. I nodded, my hands gripping the front of his jacket as I tried to catch my breath. "Yeah," I said, my voice trembling but certain. "I'm okay." Mark smiled, his thumb brushing lightly against my cheek. "Good," he said, "because I don't think I can stop now." His words lingered in the air, sending a shiver through me that I couldn't suppress. Mark's hand stayed on my waist, firm but gentle, as though he was both holding me steady and grounding himself in the moment. My breath was shallow, each inhale filling me with the faint scent of him, woodsy, sharp, intoxicating. The city outside the cab might as well have disappeared. The traffic, the rain, the endless sea of headlights, it was all just background noise now. I felt his fingers tighten slightly, his thumb brushing against the fabric of my shirt in slow, deliberate circles. The tenderness of the gesture contrasted with the tension in his eyes, the hunger that lingered just beneath the surface. I couldn't look away from him, couldn't do anything but let myself get lost in the pull of him. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low and rough. The question shouldn't have felt so monumental, but it did. Everything about this moment felt bigger than it was, more charged, like we'd crossed some invisible line and there was no going back. I didn't trust myself to speak, so I nodded, my hands gripping his jacket as though it was the only thing keeping me steady. Mark's lips curved into a small, almost triumphant smile, and then he was kissing me again, deeper this time, his hand sliding up my back as he pulled me closer. His touch was confident, sure, and it made my head spin in the best possible way. I felt his other hand move, brushing against my leg before resting on my thigh, his fingers pressing into the fabric as though testing the boundaries of what I'd allow. The heat of his palm seeped through my clothes, sending a wave of warmth coursing through me that made my pulse race. I didn't pull away, didn't even think about it. Instead, I shifted slightly, leaning into him as though that simple act could convey everything I was feeling, everything I didn't have the words to say. His lips left mine, trailing down to my jaw, his breath warm against my skin as he murmured something I couldn't quite catch. My hands moved on their own, sliding up to his shoulders as I tilted my head, giving him more access. The cab was filled with the sound of our breathing, heavy and uneven, and the occasional creak of the leather seats as we moved. Mark's hand on my thigh tightened, his fingers curling slightly, and the sensation sent a jolt through me that made me gasp. He paused at the sound, pulling back just enough to meet my gaze, his eyes searching mine as though looking for permission to keep going. I didn't hesitate. I leaned forward, closing the distance between us as my lips found his once more. There was nothing hesitant about the way he kissed me this time. It was hungry, insistent, as though he was trying to consume every part of me. His hands moved in tandem, one sliding under my shirt to rest against my lower back while the other remained on my thigh, his thumb brushing against the inside of my leg in slow, deliberate strokes. The touch was almost too much, but at the same time, it wasn't enough. I felt like I was on fire, every nerve ending alive with sensation, and all I could think about was him. His hands, his lips, the way he made me feel like I was the only person in the world. "Mark," I whispered against his mouth, my voice trembling but certain. He pulled back slightly, his forehead resting against mine as his hand stilled on my thigh. "Yeah?" he asked, his voice rough and breathless. The words caught in my throat and I hesitated, unsure of how to articulate what I was feeling. "I've never—" Mark's eyes softened and he smiled, the tension in his expression easing slightly. "Hey," he said, his hand moving up to cup my face, his thumb brushing against my cheek. "It's okay. We don't have to rush." The sincerity in his voice, the way he looked at me like he wasn't just seeing me but really seeing me, made my chest ache. I nodded, my hands tightening on his jacket as I let out a shaky breath. "I just don't want this to stop," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. His smile widened and he leaned in, pressing a soft, lingering kiss to my forehead. "It won't," he said. "Not unless you want it to." The weight of his words settled over me, grounding me in a way I hadn't expected. For the first time, I felt like I could let go, like I didn't have to hold back or second-guess myself. Mark's hands returned to my waist, steady and reassuring, as he pulled me closer, his touch more careful now, more deliberate. The rain continued to fall outside, the sound a steady rhythm against the windows, but it barely registered. All I could focus on was the way Mark's hands moved, the way his lips found mine again, slow and deliberate this time, as though savoring every moment. His touch was patient, his movements unhurried, and it made everything feel more real, more meaningful. I lost track of time as we stayed like that, the world outside the cab fading into nothingness. It wasn't until the sound of a car horn blaring behind us snapped me back to reality that I realized the traffic had started moving again. Mark pulled back, his expression soft but reluctant, and he glanced over his shoulder at the line of cars stretching out behind us. "Guess we should get going," he said, his voice tinged with regret. "Yeah," I said, though I didn't want to move, didn't want to let this moment end. Mark smiled, leaning in to press one last kiss to my lips before turning back to the wheel. As he shifted the car into gear, his hand found mine, his fingers lacing through mine in a gesture that felt as intimate as any kiss. The cab started moving, the city lights blurring into streaks of color outside the windows, but I barely noticed. My mind was still spinning, my heart still racing, and all I could think about was him, The way he'd made me feel. The way he still made me feel. As we drove, Mark's thumb brushed against the back of my hand in slow, deliberate strokes, and I couldn't help but smile. Whatever this was, wherever it was going, I knew one thing for certain. I didn't want it to end.